Welcome to the Mothers Leading the Way video series. Join us as we explore practical tips and tricks based on research to manage the many roles that working mothers play. Dr. Jen Labrecque is a social psychologist who specializes in habits and behavior change. Her research interests are consumer and health behavior change. Dr. Jen Labrecque has dedicated her professional career focusing on why change is difficult to maintain, with the goal of developing strategies to promote lasting change. Today, Jen Labrecque will be presenting Welcome to the Struggle Bus, a working mom's guide to getting stuff done.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to contribute to such a fantastic event. My name is Jen Labrecque, and today I'll be sharing with you Welcome to the Struggle Bus, a working mom's guide to getting stuff done. Now, I want to be careful not to overpromise here. So technically, this will help you get at least some stuff done, but getting everything done still isn't super likely. Just a quick bit of background on me. I earned my PhD in social psychology from the University of Southern California, fight on, and I specialized in issues of habits and behavior change. And then in 2018, I joined the faculty here at Oklahoma State University as a teaching assistant professor, and I regularly teach courses in motivation and applied social psychology. I was thrilled when I was invited to participate in this event because I recently got married and became a stepmom. My husband Adam and I have two great kids. Cademan is 10 and Clara is 6. However, as someone who spent most of her adult life living alone with only a dog and a cat for roommates, this has been quite a transition. I hadn't anticipated how tough mom life really is, especially during all the chaos of COVID and all the changes that have occurred in our lives as a result. I'm not sure about you, but my life feels a lot like this right now. Today, I'd like to share a few tips on how to get and stay motivated and how you can keep moving towards your long-term goals even when your motivation fades by developing habits. So let's start with a brief discussion about motivation. For the purposes of my talk today, there are two kinds of motivation you should be familiar with: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when doing the task itself is the reward. So I'm having fun, learning, experiencing personal growth. These are all rewarding, and therefore the task itself is rewarding. That's intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is when you really wouldn't do the task without some type of external reward. So for example, in our house, summer is coming and my son will soon be asking, what do I get if I mow the lawn? He's not going to do it without an external reward of some kind. So extrinsic motivators are generally rewards or punishments. Let's pause here for just a moment and take a little self-quiz. This is adapted from a 2015 paper on measuring motivation. I'll give you a question, some possible answers, and you can see where you tend to fall in terms of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. So here we go. How would you answer the question, why do you or would you put effort into your current job? I'll let you review the possible answers for a moment. If you tended to choose answers from box A, you are likely more intrinsically motivated at your job. On the other hand, if you primarily chose answers from box B, you seem to be a bit more extrinsically motivated at your job. Hopefully, we all have at least some things that we do in our lives because we genuinely enjoy them. That's our intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, we all have things that we would rather not do as well. And that's what I want to talk about now. What do you do if you have to complete a task, whether at work, at home, wherever, that you don't want to do? And I want to go ahead and give credit where credit is due. Many of the ideas I'll be discussing come from this book, Drive by Daniel Pink, which I highly recommend. Well, one option is to try to increase your intrinsic desire to do these tasks. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. The first one is thinking about our purpose and looking at the bigger picture. In the grand scheme of things, what does completing this task get you? I'd like to tell you about Adam Grant's call center study. It can be really tough to be a call center employee. Lots of rejection, plenty of people who aren't so nice to you. So this team of researchers wondered if having a better sense of how their work actually benefited those recipients would make a difference in how much money they raised. And in this case, they were raising money for scholarship recipients at a college. And what they found was that call center employees who actually met and had a brief conversation with a student who was one of the recipients of the scholarship fund were raising 2.5 times as much money as an employee who only read a letter about a student. In fact, fundraising for those employees who actually met the recipients went from about $200 a week to closer to $500 a week. Clearly, something changed in their motivation when they interacted with a real student who benefited from their efforts. A sense of purpose is a powerful motivator. A second way to increase your intrinsic motivation is to find a way to turn work into play, which sometimes we call the Sawyer effect. In this way, you make the activity more fun. So for example, in terms of exercise, maybe you play outside with your kids instead of walking on the treadmill, definitely more fun. Or maybe you team up, you work on a challenging project with a friend rather than on your own. Personally, I love my late night work parties with my husband, Adam. We put a fire in the fireplace, relaxing music, and keep each other company, and take advantage of the positive peer pressure to keep working. Of course, you can literally turn work into play as well. So I really would like to be healthy, but running is particularly miserable for me. So I found this app called Zombies Run. You're distracted from your pain and suffering by an interesting storyline, and occasionally you're told to increase your pace because a zombie is chasing you. Now, I think I'm a fairly level-headed person, and I know that there aren't zombies hanging out in my neighborhood waiting for me to run by. But when I hear the zombie breathing sounds getting closer and closer, you bet I pick up the pace. Turn work into play. And for those of you who are naturally competitive, there are endless options to help motivate you by competing against yourself or other people. One simple version of this is racing against time. How many of you have heard of the Pomodoro technique? This involves setting a timer for 25 minutes, working your hardest for those 25 minutes, and then taking a 5-minute break. I tend to be a fairly competitive person. And so when I see the time counting down with only a few minutes left, I'm doing everything I can to finish up so I can say done before the buzzer. There are a bunch of apps and some websites too that will make this super easy for you if you're interested. There's even a Spotify playlist that combines this timing with some focus-oriented music if that's your thing. Another thing that's becoming more common are programs where you essentially bet on yourself. For example, how much weight you can lose or how many minutes of exercise you can get in a week. If you don't meet your goal, you have to pay the company a small amount of money. But if you do meet your goal, you're the one who gets paid, essentially from the money of all the people who lost their bet and had to pay. This probably isn't for the folks who are more risk averse, but it's a great motivator for some. And this actually leads to my next point because it's associated with rewards and punishments, which means it's an extrinsic motivator. At the end of the day, if you need to get something done and you're not intrinsically motivated, go ahead and use an extrinsic motivator. Now, there are a number of reasons that it's probably better to be intrinsically motivated to do something than to rely on extrinsic motivators. Back to the example of my son mowing the lawn, he might do it for $25 today, but by the end of the summer, he'll likely be asking for more. So not as sustainable. However, sometimes you don't have a choice. Don't be afraid to use extrinsic motivators. Remember, these are rewards and punishments if that's what it takes. I teach these concepts in my motivation course. And one semester, I decided to have students keep track of their motivations for studying each week, whether they be intrinsic or extrinsic. And at the end of the week, report back about what motivators they used and how much they studied. Seems simple, right? Apparently not. A disappointingly large number of students did the following. At the beginning of the week, they told me they were intrinsically motivated to study, and therefore they didn't need to think about possible rewards or punishments to motivate them. But by the end of the week, They hadn't studied. So at the beginning of the next week, I tried to suggest, I know you said you're intrinsically motivated to study, but it looks like that wasn't quite enough motivation for you last week. Maybe you should consider using an extrinsic motivator for this week. They assure me that no, they're intrinsically motivated and they will study more this week. Same pattern all semester long. Those students who strategically chose rewards or punishments, extrinsic motivators, for their studying behavior were much more successful. So for example, if I don't finish this assignment by 6 p.m., I can't go out to dinner with my friends. That would be a punishment. Or if I do finish before 10 p.m., I can watch one episode of my favorite show, which would be a reward. This was much more effective. You may have heard the quote, "Motivation gets you started, but habit is what keeps you going." We've talked a bit about how to increase your motivation, but over time, motivation will naturally fade out for most things that you do. So what then? This is where habits come in. While motivation for an activity generally gets lower and lower the longer you do it, and ultimately you're less likely to do it after a while, the opposite is true for habits. The more you perform a habitual behavior, the more likely it is that that habit will stick. And over time, you'll increase the likelihood that you'll perform the behavior. Sounds pretty great, right? Habits have gotten a bad rep for a long time. When you think of the word habit, what comes to mind? For many of us, it's the phrase bad habit, focusing on how, especially when we're stressed, tired, or otherwise unable to exert sufficient self-control, we often fall back into our bad habits. It's why many of us are more likely to reach for donuts than an apple at the end of a very long week. But did you know that just like our habits can cause us to make bad choices, they can also cause us to make good choices? For example, in a 2013 study, researchers in Los Angeles found that when our willpower or motivational energy is low, we're more likely to perform our habits. And that's true whether they're bad or good habits. So essentially in these situations, when our willpower is low, we have a hard time making decisions or choosing to do something different. So we fall back into what we always do, our habits. When we've established habits that support our goals, this in fact leads to positive outcomes rather than negative. So for example, in one of their studies, MBA students with lowered self-control resources because it was an exam week were more likely to choose unhealthy snacks if that was their habit. But for those students with habits to choose healthy snacks, they actually ate more healthfully during this stressful time. A number of research studies have similarly demonstrated how positive habits can help people stay on track towards their long-term goals. A 2014 study examined this in a sample of high school seniors, and they found that those students with stronger homework habits were more likely to turn in their homework on time, they had higher GPAs, and they were more likely to successfully make it through their first year of college. So self-control doesn't have to be all about willpower. In fact, people who demonstrate high levels of self-control are often taking advantage of beneficial habits to accomplish their long-term goals. I hope I've convinced you how valuable it can be to form positive habits. With that in mind, let's talk just a bit about how habits work and how you can form these positive habits. So what are habits anyway? There are many different definitions of habit, both in the way we commonly use the term in our society and in the psychological literature. So for simplicity, just for today, we will define habits as behaviors that are repeated in a stable context. So two key components, right? The first one's repetition. You've repeated this behavior in the past, often many times. And the second part is the stable context. When you've performed this behavior in the past, you've usually done it in the same context. So what counts as context? Well, one potentially obvious context is a physical context, a location or the environment that you're in. For example, like your desk at work. You can also have a temporal context, just things like time of day or sometimes even month or year. You can have a social context, which is derived from the people who are around you when you perform this behavior. Or even an internal context, which is things like thoughts and moods that may be associated with performing this behavior. So for example, maybe I bite my fingernails when I'm nervous. And finally, preceding actions in a sequence can also be a context. So what you've done previously can cue what you do next. So for example, if I always floss after brushing my teeth. Brushing my teeth is the context that cues me to floss. So habits are behaviors repeated in a stable context. But what makes us perform this behavior in the first place? Well, initially, goals generally motivate the behavior, which is how we come to repeat it over and over. However, once we've repeated the behavior many times and formed a direct association between the context that we're in and the behavior itself, goals are no longer necessary. When we perceive that context, the behavior comes to mind automatically. So an example, to make this a little bit easier to understand, I recently had to check my odometer reading for my car insurance. So I went out to my car, I sat down in the driver's seat, I pushed my little start button on the car, and then I put on my seatbelt. Now, obviously the seatbelt wasn't necessary for checking the odometer. However, once I'd performed all the other steps of my starting the car habit sequence, I did it automatically, despite the fact that my goal was simply to read the odometer in my driveway without going anywhere. Okay, so if you're still with me, that habits can be helpful ways to pursue your long-term goals, how can you go about starting to form these good habits? Well, one of the strategies that's been commonly used to help form new habits is called implementation intentions. Now, this is just a fancy name for creating an if-then plan for when, where, and how you'll perform this behavior. Notice how the when and where parts help to establish that stable context. By planning ahead like this, you can anticipate challenges ahead of time and avoid them so you're not derailed. So for example, maybe your son decided recently that he's going to be vegetarian, and so you need to start packing his lunch every day rather than relying on school lunch. Welcome to my home life. You'd like to form a new habit to do this task to make it easier to complete even when you're tired, stressed, or distracted. So let's make an implementation intention. Remember, this is when, where, and how I will make his lunch. So I could say when, after I get out of the shower, where I will go to the kitchen, and how I will get out his lunchbox and put in the PB&J, piece of fruit, and yogurt that I have waiting in the fridge. Now, I mentioned that this is helpful in anticipating barriers. How does that work? Well, it says that I should have already made the parts of his lunch and it's ready in the fridge. If when I go to make his lunch, I realize that we're out of peanut butter, I'll have to panic search the kitchen for something else for him to eat. Having it already prepared takes away the risk of that issue. I've also already planned exactly what will go into his lunchbox. Why is that important? Well, if you're anything like me, you may not be a morning person, and trying to decide on what to put in a lunchbox when you're in a morning brain fog can result in less than ideal choices. Like when my husband sent him to school one day with 3 granola bars because we were running late and he didn't know what to pack. People often ask, how long does it take to form a habit? You may have heard that it takes about 3 weeks or 21 days to form a habit, but that is a myth. The actual research suggests that it can take anywhere from about 18 days to more than 250 days to form a habit, with the average time being about 2 months. The time it takes will depend on the person and the habit you're trying to form. So if you've been trying to form a new habit and it's taking longer than you expected, don't worry. You're probably well on your way. It's just going to take a little longer. Now, we've been discussing how habits can help keep you on track towards your long-term goals, even during times of stress, by helping you to successfully control your behavior without relying on a lot of willpower. To finish up today, I'd like to briefly mention a related concept, external self-control. This is the idea that you can use strategies to set up your environment in a way that avoids having to repeatedly exert self-control. Habits can certainly be a means of external self-control, but there are many others. For example, maybe you want to eat healthier at home, so you get rid of all the junk food in your house and ensure that there are lots of healthy snacks available. Research has shown that this strategy is very successful. Rather than having to choose an apple over that bag of chips, which requires self-control, you don't have to make that choice because the chips aren't there. If you have to keep things in your house but don't want to be tempted by them, make them harder to see or reach. Put fruits and veggies front and center in the fridge and healthy snacks at the front of your pantry. If you really want that chocolate bar, you can still get it from the back of your shelf. But if you're just hungry and looking for a snack, you'll be much more likely to pick something you can easily see, like healthy almonds. Another example that I personally find particularly helpful is if you're trying to declutter your mind and still remember all the things you need to do, you can use calendars, to-do lists, and alarms to help. I have alarms on my phone for everything. My husband actually thinks it's a little bit ridiculous that I have an alarm going off every few hours, but that's how I structure my environment to help me remember to go to class on time, take out the trash can on Monday nights, and to pick up the kids after school. As moms, we're often the person responsible for keeping the schedule, and it's just not possible to keep track of everything in your head and still be productive. So this is a way to keep track of everything without taking up valuable real estate in your mind. Finally, I know that people often struggle with procrastination. I have this issue just like everyone else. To help myself, I've found a couple of tools that I'd like to share with you. There are many, many others. These are just some of the ones that I've used and benefited from, and both of these are free extensions in Chrome. The first is called Stay Focused. This app allows you to block time-wasting websites. You can either block them entirely during certain days and times, or you can allocate an acceptable amount of time, for example, an hour, after which they'll be blocked for the remainder of the day. This program actually does a great job of making you set goals in advance and then stick to them. The second tool I'd like to mention is Rescue Time. While it doesn't actually prevent you from going to any websites like Stay Focused does, it helps keep you accountable by providing a report of your productivity at the end of every week. It includes how much time you spent on the computer, how productive you were based on the websites and applications that you used, and it provides a list of the websites and apps where you spent the most time. I didn't fully realize how much time I wasted before I started using Rescue Time. It has made me more productive without me really having to exert any additional self-control. I actually look forward to seeing improvement in my report every week. In closing, I just want to say one more time that mom life is not easy. We need to have patience and compassion with ourselves as we do the very best we can, both at work and at home. I really hope this information has been helpful to you, and I want to wish you a very happy Mother's Day. You deserve to be celebrated. If you're interested in learning more about habits, I encourage you to check out Good Habits, Bad Habits, The Science of Making Positive Changes That Stick by Dr. Wendy Wood. Wendy was my grad advisor and is one of the foremost experts in the world on habits. I think you'll really enjoy it. Thank you again.
The Mothers Leading the Way team is grateful for the support of the Jane Nelson Institute for Women's Leadership at Texas Women's University, as well as Positive Leadership at positiveleadership.com.